All right, good morning, everyone. It is 10:01 a.m., so we are going to get started now with our webinar. My name is Nellie Fry, and I'm the Community and Civic Engagement Director at the Michigan Nonprofit Association. We really appreciate you all joining us this morning on our webinar, as you can see from the title page here, on Census 2020 Operations 101, where all of our panelists will spend some time discussing how the census will be conducted and various activities that nonprofits and yourselves can do to help our communities prepare for the census. As you all probably know, the census is conducted every 10 years to determine the number of people living in the United States. The census information, this count, is so incredibly important. It shapes the communities in which we live and work. Everything from education to transportation to businesses and nonprofits routinely rely on census data to determine where services are needed and resources are allocated. As you can see from the agenda, we have a packed agenda today, and during this webinar, we'll go through all the various items that we can be doing to really ensure a fair and accurate count. First, we'll have Joan Gustafson from the Michigan Nonprofit Association, who will be sharing an overview of the Michigan Nonprofit Count campaign. And then our state demographer, Eric Guthrie, will discuss how a census is actually conducted. Rounding out our esteemed panelists today is Melissa Smiley from the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, who will share strategies on how nonprofits can be engaged with any Get Out the Count effort. The webinar today will be moderated by myself, Nellie, and Erin Pratt, our census consultant at the Michigan Nonprofit Association. In terms of housekeeping and participation, this webinar is being recorded and a recording will be emailed out to you by the end of the week. There's also going to be time for Q&A after each of our presenters talk. You can type your question directly into the chat box on the right-hand side there, and Erin or myself will make sure it's asked during the appropriate time. Or you can raise your virtual hand and we can unmute you so you can ask our panelists directly. Panelists, know that I'll be moving the slide deck forward, so when you want the next slide to appear, just let me know. All right, we're going to get started now. So first up, we have Joan.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Be Counted Michigan 2020 webinar. I'm going to talk about the nonprofit campaign overview this morning. This campaign was launched in July of 2017, so we've been at it now for about 2 years already. And the purpose of this campaign is to involve and activate the nonprofit community to help the state get a complete and accurate count in the 2020 census. All elements of the campaign are up and running. And as you see on your screen right now, there's a screenshot of our website. At the very top, you'll see the address is becountedmi2020.com. This website has a number of features. It can be looked at in Arabic, Spanish, as well as English. It has an About Us tab, an Engage tab, and a Resources tab that has all kinds of information about the campaign, that free downloadable resources and other information that can be useful to you in your activities going forward. As I said, the campaign was launched in July 2017 when MNA, Michigan Nonprofit Association, was awarded a 3-year grant from the Kellogg Foundation. Since that time, more than 40 foundations throughout the state and the state of Michigan have invested in this campaign. And for a full list of all the foundations and the state, you can look at the About Us tab on the website, and all the organizations are listed. It was modeled on a similar campaign that MNA ran back in 2010. However, this campaign is much larger in scope and scale, not only because we started early, but because of the big investment that's been made by the philanthropy community in the state. If you go to the next slide, you can get a sense of what is at stake for Michigan. There is a lot at stake. for our communities. Of course, the distribution of the 435 congressional seats that determines the power that Michigan has to protect the things that we care about in Washington. We've lost 2 seats over the last 2 censuses, and we are in danger of losing another seat this time. So while power is, of course, one very important consequence of getting everybody counted, the funding piece is the other big issue. Last time, Michigan was awarded more than $15 billion in federal and state program dollars, and this time we're estimating that for each person that's not counted, we stand to lose $1,800 per person per year, and of course that's for 10 years because there's no do-overs. This is our one time to count people, and we have to be, and we'll be using those numbers for the next 10 years. This is particularly important for Michigan because more than 40% of our state budget relies on federal funding. So as you can see, just some of the biggest programs that the funding is allocated based on population are Medicaid, Medicare, nutritional programs, WIC school lunches and SNAP, education, Head Start, special ed, highways, housing. These are all programs that are very important to the state, and we're competing with other states for this finite amount of pool of federal dollars. So if you look at the next slide, ever since we started this campaign, a lot of people ask, well, why are the nonprofits involved in this? Isn't this a U.S. Census Bureau or a federal government activity or mandate? And yes, it is, of course. The Census Bureau is mandated by our Constitution to do an actual enumeration of every single person who's living in the United States. But this is also very important for the nonprofit sector, and for 2 main reasons. Our campaign is focusing solely on populations that are historically undercounted, not just this time around, but in many past census counts. Those populations include people who live in poverty, immigrants, and people who speak English as a second language, some communities of color, and young children ages 0 to 5. And these are populations that nonprofits interact with for the most part. And so we feel we're uniquely qualified as community organizations to communicate with people that the census is easy, safe, and very important for our communities. And this message is much more palatable from trusted nonprofits and community organizations, much more so than if this message was coming from either the federal government in Washington, D.C., or even our state government in Lansing. So, number one, we feel that we have a good chance of communicating to people and getting the best count that we can. The other piece is the funding piece. As I mentioned, this $800 per person per year figure, that represents multi-millions of dollars just by missing a few thousand people. And nonprofits know that if we're not drawing down these federal dollars that we're entitled to for programs that are important to us here in the state and for the most vulnerable people here in the state, that communities then tend to look to nonprofits to fill in those gaps. And there's no way that we can fill in the kind of gap funding that we're talking about here if we miss even just, thousands of people in a community. So when we, and if you look at the next slide, when we started to look at how we were going to frame out our campaign and how we were going to organize it, one of the things that we took into consideration was that the Census Bureau has been directed to spend less money on this census in 2020 than it has in the past. And some of the cost-cutting measures that have been implemented included, of course, the Internet First model, which will be, very convenient and a big cost saving for many of us, although, of course, it's going to come with its own unique challenges. But the other thing is that the Census Bureau located many fewer offices in our state than it did last time. And the number of staff at the Census Bureau is going to be locating here in Michigan is less than it was last time. And so when we looked at how we would frame our campaign, we landed on a hub model. And if you see by this framework graphic right now, this was really in large part because of, or to address this new reality that there's going to be less offices and less staff here. So on the first column, you'll see that a large part of the campaign is going to be run, the infrastructure piece of it, by Michigan Nonprofit Association. Those things include the creation of our statewide complete count committee, the communications plan, the training and technical assistance, the data and research piece, and also the advocacy piece that includes our position that against including the citizenship question, our position to advocate and lobby for a fully funded census, and some of the other things that we've been doing on a national level for the last couple of years. The middle column shows the regional hubs that have been identified and that are working right now to develop regional plans that make sense for their areas. You know, as you can imagine, a plan that might be put into place for the UP or up in northern Michigan will look very different from a plan developed by an urban area such as Flint. And those plans have been in place now for at least 6 to 8 months. And there are 13 regional hubs that are being run by large nonprofits like community foundations and United Ways. And there are also then 13 hubs and 6 action agencies that are covering the state with nonprofits to make sure that we get a complete count. And if you look at our website on the Engage page, that's where you will see the list of the census hubs. And also on the Engage page, you can sign up for our Monday morning newsletter, and you can also see any of the webinars and events and community events that are going to start happening now this fall, going into peak census operation time next spring. And then the last column shows the local nonprofit grantees, or the boots on the ground organizations that are the communities that interact with and understand the cultural sensitivities of the populations that we are targeting to communicate, again, that the census is going to be easy, safe, and important for our communities. Also, while I was talking about the resources page on the website too, all of the resources that are listed, all the publications, all the documents, all the collateral pieces, are all free to download and print for anybody who wants to access them. The last slide that I was going to show is this campaign coverage slide. And as I mentioned, the 13 nonprofit census hubs, which you'll see in blue, cover 56 counties. The 6 community action agencies are the orange areas that cover 23 counties. And there's just basically 4 remaining counties that weren't necessarily covered by a formal relationship with our nonprofit complete count committee. But I do want to let everybody know that there are nonprofits and local government organizations that are doing great work in those areas. In fact, Washtenaw County this week is launching their complete count committee, and I know that there are a lot of nonprofits that are working in that area, and the same goes for the 3 the northern counties that are listed in white up north. So when we started in 2017 with the original funding from the Kellogg Foundation, we were saying at that time that based on the funding we have right now, we're concentrating on 4 cities that had a large undercount in the last census. And then based on the interest and the investment and going forward, we will try to expand as much as we can. And so now, here we are these couple years later, we really do have a true statewide campaign that nonprofits will be working with their local government counterparts to make sure that we make this a big success for Michigan. If anybody has any questions about the nonprofit campaign, please let me know either today, or please, feel free to email me or text me in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Joan. This is Erin Skeen-Pratt, a consultant working with the Michigan Nonprofit Association on the campaign. Really appreciate everyone joining us on a Monday morning. Just wanted to quickly remind everyone that we have another speaker coming up, and then we will go ahead and take some questions. So please feel free to type your questions in the question box, or also feel free to raise your virtual hand, and we'll unmute you when we get to that point. So glad that we heard from Joan in terms of an overview on why the census is important, as well as hearing about the campaign that we're hoping you all will plug into. But we wanted to make sure that you also understood how this census 2020 is going to work. As you'll probably frequently hear, this is not your grandmother's census. It's being done a little bit differently. So for nonprofits to really understand how to engage in this effort, you kind of have to have a better understanding of how this census is going to work. And the best person to do that is certainly Eric Guthrie, who is our state demographer, and he is our census expert in the state. So with that, Eric, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks for having me to talk about a little bit about the census today. When we talk about who's going to be counted in the census, it's really all persons living in the United States on April 1st. There are some particular circumstances that give people some trouble, and we'll talk a little bit more about those when we talk about the residency rule. But for the vast majority of people, this particular rule is not confusing. If you're living in the United States on April 1st, then you fill out the census in your usual place of residence. The census is essentially a household survey, so every household or every address will receive the mailings that will prompt people to either go online or fill out a census form and return it to the Census Bureau. When a household receives the census form, one adult from that household should fill out the form, and fill out the form for every person in that household. This is sometimes where some people get missed when we go back to that residency rule and we talk about who should and should not be counted. But generally, it's every person in the household. There's really only a couple of circumstances where a person would not be counted, and those are particularly rare. Invitations are going to start going out in March for the census. As soon as a household receives an invitation, they can either complete the form or go online and complete the form. They should complete the form as of either they expect their household to look like on April 1st or how it did look like on April 1st, if you're not actually filling it out on April 1st. Households are going to have, the entire month of April and generally May before any sort of follow-up contact is going to be made from the census for non-response follow-up. There are some special types of households that will get talked about that will get some response follow-up a little bit early. But generally, college students, things like that. Most people are not going to fall into that category. This census, as was already said, is not your grandmother's census, and that's kind of a truism just because of how the data are being collected this time. The primary response mode for the census is intended to be the internet. If the internet's not an option, they're hoping that people use the phone or the paper questionnaire. The goal is high response. How the data comes in is a little bit less important than just making sure the data comes in. Okay, you can go to the next slide for me. When we talk about having trouble with the census or response modes with the census, there is going to be assistance available for every single response mode. At the very least, there's a phone number that people can call to get assistance. And generally, when people make that call, the person who answers the phone can also take their information so that they can complete the census right then and there as well. It's designed to be fairly easy, so there'll be a lot of online assistance provided within the online app, within the online tool itself. There will be also multiple language assistance available within the online tool and also on the telephone as well. I believe about the 13 largest or most common languages other than English in the United States will be supported, and then there'll be additional paper-based assistance available for 59 additional languages. When we talk about the 3 response modes, the internet response mode is new for this census. It's concerning for some persons in terms of access or availability or people's comfort in submitting data online. I can tell you that the census has taken a lot of pains to make sure this will be a very safe and effective means for response, but regardless, there'll be those other 2 modes as well available to everybody in the United States. It's not that people have to fill it out online. The census will provide, would prefer it to come online for accuracy and for cost-saving reasons. If we can go to the next slide. The residency criteria for determining who should fill out the census and where they should fill it out is pretty straightforward. The individuals in a household should be counted as their usual residence where they live or sleep most of the time. Again, this is not a confusing concept for most persons, but there are some exceptions where people do have some questions. So, for example, in Michigan, the question often comes up about where do snowbirds count themselves. They're a unique circumstance in that they'll have 2 different addresses, so they will receive a form at both addresses. They should fill out the census with the form at the address that they live and sleep most of the year. So 50% of the year plus 1 day. That's the location they should fill it out. If that's Michigan, then they should fill it out with their Michigan form. If that's another state, then they should fill it out in the other state. College students are another one that often gets a lot of questions. College students should fill out their census form at their school, at the location where they're going to school. If they're living in the dorms, they'll be counted in the group quarters operation, so there's not really anything additional that they'll have to do. If they're living around the school in a housing unit, they should be getting their forms a little bit early, and they'll be targeted for non-response follow-up early because Census knows that they'll be leaving the area before normal non-response follow-up options have really begun. There are certain types of group quarters that are not counted at the facility. This is a very rare circumstance, and most people will not have to worry about this. Generally, that's the only one the most common one I can think of, which would not be a very common one, would be students living in boarding schools that are under the post-secondary level. They would be counted at their home rather than the group quarters. But again, a very rare circumstance. Generally, group quarters are counted at the group quarters facility, and that enumeration is handled by the employees of the group quarters. If people do not have a usual place of residence, say you remember back to your younger years, perhaps, or my younger years, when you had a friend sleeping on your couch. That friend is sleeping on your couch and does not have a usual place of residence anywhere else, and he should be counted in your household if he slept there on April 1st. Transitory locations include places like RV parks, carnivals, marinas, and daily, nightly, weekly hotels. Those are counted also in a separate operation conducted by Census because those are, again, people who may not have a usual place of residence or may not be in their usual place of residence. Okay, we can go to the next slide. If a household does not respond to the census via one of the 3 methods, then Census will conduct non-response follow-up, meaning they're going to go out and they're going to knock on every door that doesn't respond to the census to make sure that either the address is vacant or that they get data about a particular address. When we talk about what that timeline is going to look like for the whole census, including the non-response follow-up, an initial invitation is going to go out in March, and these are going to go out in batches so that the system isn't overwhelmed. As soon as somebody gets that first invitation, they can go ahead and start responding to the census. Another invitation is going to go out later in March, and then a third that should land around April 1st. Following that, the household will receive a reminder letter with a paper form, paper questionnaire, and then they'll get another reminder postcard. Some time will go on. If they don't respond again, they'll get another reminder. Starting in around June, non-response follow-up will begin, and people will start knocking on doors to collect those data. I think that is all the material that I have, but I can certainly take any questions that anybody might have about any of the material that we've gone over today, or any other questions they might have that I can help with.
Thanks, Eric. There seems to be a few questions on the data. So on the 2010 data, is there a way to determine which census block maps to city wards, and do census blocks or any larger designation map neatly to the city ward level?
City ward level, is that local geography? Is that like a political geography, like the voting districts and things like that? There are 2010 data, you can do it. Well, when we talk about data, do you mean just population data, or are you talking about like response rate data?
My guess is they're asking about response rate.
Yeah, probably not. The geographies that we have for response rates are either going to be census tracts or block groups. But I mean, you can see, there's a tool, census.gov/Rome, that you can look at and visually see how those different geographies compared. And if you have GIS capability in your house, you can make maps and see how it looks, but it would take some expertise to do that.
Great. And Nellie will put in the chat box for everyone that website that you just mentioned, the Rome website, which is a good way to kind of navigate and look for information about the areas and demographics. So another question is, what's the best way to determine which census designation map is solely the city of Ann Arbor, excluding townships?
The city of Ann Arbor is getting better, but it looks kind of like Swiss cheese, because you're right, there's a lot of townships cut out of it. That's census, again, Census does provide the tiger shape files that you can make your own maps with. Otherwise, I don't think that the Rome map gives you a particular. If you're looking at really at that difference in the local area between the city and the townships, you're probably going to have to either look at maps that are produced by the Michigan's Center for Shared Solutions, or use the tiger shape files. I'm not the only resource that you might be able to kind of get a view of that without having to make your own map would be if you went to Census has an online mapping tool. It's called TigerWeb. So if you just Google TigerWeb Census, it should be the first link that comes up, and it's an online mapping tool that you can zoom in on Ann Arbor, and you can click on the layers for places, and it'll show you what Census has for its current designations of the difference between the city and the townships. But that's a little bit more difficult to do as well. And if you have specific questions about it, I would suggest you reach out to me individually, and I can help you with that.
Yeah, and we can make sure that folks have your contact information, Eric, so they can reach you. So another question, and obviously this campaign the nonprofit campaign is specifically tailored to encourage nonprofits to be helping to make sure that those who are traditionally undercounted are counted in their communities. But one of the questions is about educational materials that might be available for teachers. So I know that the
MEA, the Early Childhood Investment Corporation, and some media outlets like DPTV, their channel, their children's channel, is specifically, the audience is children 0 to 8 years old, where English is their second language, which is exactly the demographic that we're trying to get counted, that's historically undercounted. So there are some other resources as well.
Great, thanks, Jones. We'll make sure the NEAKC link is up there, as well as the statistics from the school. So I think that's all the questions that we have for Eric right now. And I'm going to turn things over to Melissa Smiley, who is the administrator at the Southeast Michigan Hub. And she is also in her day job with the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, which is hosting the Hub in Southeast Michigan. And so Melissa's going to go through a little bit more in terms of how nonprofits can be involved in each kind of portion of this campaign. And Melissa, I'll hand things over to you.
Great, thanks, Erin. After Joan and Eric's presentations, we're hoping you're already thinking about ways you and your organizations may engage in the census. My goal today is to leave you with two kind of big picture things. First, I hope you'll know that your organization can play a role, however big or small, that will be helpful to getting out a fair and accurate count. And second, I hope you leave today with a greater understanding of sort of a timeline and how the types of messages you might deliver over that timeline will change. As Erin mentioned, yes.
I'm so sorry. Sorry, everyone. Can you just pause 1 second here? I'm having technical difficulty with our Detroit office interwebs.
Sure.
Although it does sound like you can still see the PowerPoint.
It's still on the question and answers page, but I can see it.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Please hold.
Hey, Melissa. While we are waiting, there was another question that I was going to actually pitch to you towards the end, so maybe we could attack that right now. So this is obviously a very common question right now in terms of concerns regarding the citizenship questions. So how do we calm the fears of undocumented citizens? How would you suggest that we deal with the issue when confronted?
So the questioner is asking about the possibility that there will be a question on the census ascertaining someone's citizenship status or the citizenship status of all of the members of the household. And I think the first thing to make sure everyone understands is it's not actually been 100% determined yet, so we are waiting for some court rulings on that. So that's one of the things that's sort of still an evolving part of this kind of census outreach. And if you're going to get engaged on census, it's something to take to make sure you're paying attention to. That being said, the possibility of this question appearing on the census has definitely already made some of the work potentially harder to convince people that filling out this form is a good idea. There are definitely populations that are concerned about how their data might be used and whether or not they want to report it themselves or some member of their family is not a citizen. From what I understand, and I'm not an expert on this, a lot of very smart organizations have had a lot of focus groups and talked to a lot of people about this. And one of the messages that seems to make the most sense is to actually be really honest and acknowledge that it feels a little bit risky and that it feels a little bit like, it's a risk for filling out the form. You can, of course, tell people that there are federal laws that prevent the Census Bureau from sharing individual level data, and you can talk exactly about how all of those things work. But sometimes hearing that there's a federal law may or may not provide the most comfort. So in my case, what most of the organizations I'm working with are thinking about doing is really being honest with people. It feels a little bit risky, but what is also 100% risky is if entire communities opt out of getting counted, and then the dollars for the programs that they need and that your neighbors need and that your kids need are not going to be there. And so it's really about kind of balancing those two things and then ultimately, hopefully making a decision that feels like the right one for the community.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. And if folks have any follow-up questions on that or any questions in general, just a reminder that we'll do another Q&A session after your section. And I think we are ready to roll again with the slides. Thanks for everyone's patience.
Okay, so this is Melissa again, and I'm going to keep going. So I want to just make it clear, I'm also presenting from the perspective of a funder who's working with dozens of nonprofits on their census work. I know they are contemplating a wide range of activities that they're going to engage in over the next several months, and it's more than I'm going to list in this presentation. I'm sure you also are thinking about other outreach activities that I don't mention. So if I don't say the kinds of things you're thinking about, that doesn't mean they're not a good idea. It just means it didn't make it in my slides. So the slide you're looking at now shows 3 outreach phases, and they are overlapping. And the first thing to note is that the first 2 are already happening. So we're not talking about something that you should think about engaging in a couple of weeks or months. We're talking about something that many people are already engaging in now, and the sooner you can engage, the better. So the very first phase that you see there is about raising awareness. Think of this as just talking about the upcoming census with anyone, talking about it at staff meetings so that all of your employees are understanding this is coming up, at board meetings so your board members get it, talking about it with friends and family and in newsletters. Anywhere that you can raise awareness about the upcoming census is a good idea. Awareness also includes the likelihood of an undercount and what that undercount might mean for your community, or mentioning changes to the census like Eric already went over. Most people, even people who reliably filled out the census every 10 years for their whole lives, aren't aware that there's going to be some differences in this upcoming census. So raising awareness is a great idea, starting now and running through the rest of this year. Now is also a good time to talk about how census might just be integrated in the regular activities of your organization. You may engage on census not because you're going to launch some big standalone campaign, but because you have routine kinds of outreach and interaction with your community that happens all the time on a variety of issues, and this is a matter of just making sure census is one of those things. The middle phase there, which runs for the same amount of time as the raising awareness phase, is really more internal to your organization. You might want to pause and think about how your funding is related to a census count and how an undercount might affect your organization, might affect the community you serve, and might affect your ability to serve that community and do all of the good things that you're doing now. This kind of information is going to be key going forward, potentially in motivating your community and your constituents to engage in census themselves. Note that right now, both of those phases have nothing to do with telling people that they should fill out their census form. Raising awareness is really just about getting ready for things. It's not about moving someone to that action. Most people are going to need to hear messages about census many times before they actually engage, which is why there's a difference in the kind of messages you do over time. Starting in January of 2020 is when that message shifts to really telling people, asking people, imploring people to actually engage. And Eric already went over that, you know, starting in March is when those invitations are going to go out. But it's really in 2020 that that engagement piece changes there. You can go to the next slide. So this is suggested activities now in June and August of 2019. And again, there might be things you're thinking of doing that aren't on here. You might decide to do them later or do them earlier. This is just kind of a baseline. So right now, again, sharing information with your staff, with your board, with your network. A really simple thing you can do is add a link to the BeCountedMI2020.com website to your own website. You can pull up some other resources as well. If you just put a little thing on there that says, hey, are you interested in census? Click here to read more. It's a great thing to do right now. Under the organizational capacity in the middle, I really just want to highlight that last point, assigning a staff person or a volunteer as your liaison. Even if you're really going to do a very light, kind of small engagement on census, it is really helpful to have one person who is your census person on your staff. It doesn't mean that they're spending hours and hours and hours doing this, though it might. But it's helpful for your own staff to go and ask them questions. It's helpful for them to just maybe dig up a few resources, a couple things that can go on social media. So even if it's small, having a point person, it's also the point person who might link with other organizations that are doing bigger things that you could help with. A really good idea. That could be a vice president level person, or it could be a very junior staff person who really likes data and understands how to get on the census website and pull a lot of interesting stuff about the community. You know, you're going to know your organization best. Also on the build relationship side, I think people already said to connect with your local hub. If you're in Southeast Michigan, absolutely contact me. Go on to the next slide. So this is September and December. The first thing it says here I want to call your attention to on the raise awareness side is develop messages to connect the census to your work. Developing messages doesn't mean sitting down with a blank sheet of paper and trying to dream up what the message should be for census awareness. There are so many resources out there, some of which are on that statewide campaign. Once you start looking around, you can find a lot of free materials, many of which can also be altered a little bit. So if you find something great, but you need to change the language just slightly because you know what will work with your community, you should be able to do that. So the whole point here is that you should not have to start with scratch. You should be able to find even full toolkits that you can just download and be ready to go. They'll be there for you. I think Joan mentioned this previously when she was talking about how nonprofits are great to engage on this. The messenger matters more in a lot of cases than the message itself. So if you find other resources and you think they'll work, it's really about those relationships you have with the people you're going to be talking with that's going to make this the most helpful. Also, under building relationships on the right side, it does talk about contacting your city or county about complete count committees. Many of those are already forming, and so that might be an earlier step than September or December, but it's definitely something this fall. If you haven't yet, you should try to connect with, but you might even start with that now. Next slide. This is now where we get to that January to May part where we're really about motivating and encouraging participation. There's more activities listed here, presentations at conferences or in the community, sharing resources and articles, and I do think there'll be more activity during this time. But I also want to emphasize that the biggest difference here is still that message, that you're really sharing information about acting on the census. Some of these activities, including making presentations, and other things like that, you may also do in the fall where you're really raising awareness. Also, this is the only slide where you see the idea of phone banking or door-to-door educational canvassing. I know many organizations are actually going to be canvassing this summer. Summer is actually the time when they canvass, when they go door-to-door and talk with folks in their neighborhood about a variety of issues. And they're adding census to those conversations, or some of them are doing it this fall as well. I also know that door-to-door canvassing in Michigan doesn't always work in January or February. So again, you know your communities and you know your organizational capacity the best, and really just thinking about how the message might change as you're doing those things. Let me go on to the final slide there. These are just things to consider, most of which I've already hinted at. The very first one, this is an evolving process. So not just the citizenship question, which we brought up earlier, but a number of different things might change how you approach. You know, I think it's changed how some municipalities have engaged earlier and a number of different things. So I think it's important to keep flexible as you're paying attention and seeing how this might work. From a community capacity standpoint, again, you're going to know your communities best. That's why you are some of the better messengers for them. And how they're affected by what's happening in the environment may change over the time that you're engaging on census, and so it's important to keep that in mind. In addition, like everything nonprofits do, it's important to keep organizational capacity in mind. So, you know, there are, like I said, organizations that already do canvassing, and it's really easy for them to add census to that. If that's not your organization, there's something else that you perhaps do very well that you can add a little bit of census to, and that works better, so you're not launching a whole new thing just for this purpose. And then the final, in terms of resources and staff, just not forgetting that educating staff and making sure your staff and your volunteers know what's going on so they can have those conversations is a really valuable thing and a fairly light lift for most people to do. And again, lots of resources out there, toolkits and other things to help with those kinds of training. And I think that's it. We can go to the next slide and take any questions that you have.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. Really appreciate it. And again, we want everyone to feel like they can play a role in this, you know, regardless of what your organization's capacity is. And there were several different types of suggested activities listed on that timeline, and we'll also put that out in a PDF for folks so that you can utilize that and refer to it. But as Melissa said, being flexible and deciding what best works for your community and timing. So with that, we have a couple of questions, and actually, Joan, this question might be for you. This is related to, I think they're relating to collateral materials or some of the materials that Melissa probably mentioned in relation to information on getting the word out regarding raising awareness regarding the census. Do you want to mention what collateral materials are available for folks, how they get a hold of it? There was questions about whether or not they have to print it themselves, kind of give them the rundown.
Yep. So probably the most beneficial collateral piece that's just been developed is a flyer that's been developed for general audiences that is now going to be translated into a number of different languages. So it's like an FAQ, a RAT card. It's, you know, it's like it would be three different three different flyers per an 8.5 by 11 sheet, and it's double-sided. So if you had a printer take that and print it, you could have 3 to a page. And there is a spot on there where each organization can include their logo. So right now it has the Be Counted MI 2020 logo on it, U.S. Census Bureau logo on it, and then there's like a space where you can put your own organization logo on it. It asks and answers very basic questions about the Census Bureau, when, you know, the timeline, what's on the form, what's it used for, etc. And there's also a poster that accompanies that too, that you can have printed and put up in your lunchroom or in your organization. So yes, those are both available on the resources page of the website for your organization to have printed. We made them very basic, no fancy stuff, no bleeds. I mean, they're very cheap and easy to have printed. And as I said, the flyer would be 3 to a page, so that's even more of a cost savings there. Also in development are myth versus fact sheet, children's coloring pages. Somebody asked about, you know, getting kids and getting families with kids engaged in this. There's also going to be developed placemats for diners in rural areas that just have, you know, the census information on it, and a number of other collateral pieces as we move forward that will be kind of updated and tweaked, the language tweaked just a little bit as we go forward, especially, for example, when the citizenship question is decided, we might add that, you know, to what's on the census question, for example. But all that's on the site and all of it's free to download. We do not do printing for everybody. That would be your responsibility.
Hey, Joan, while you're still on the line, there's a question about the citizenship question. So can you elaborate more about the court decision that may determine the citizenship question on the census? That will
Yep, absolutely. In fact, I just got an email this morning that the decision will not come down today, so we're still watching. But it is our understanding that because the Supreme Court adjourns at the end of this month, that within any time now between and June 28th, we will have a decision as to whether or not that question is included on the form. As you know, it was very controversial that that question was added at a late date because it's not been tested, and there's, you know, a lot of anxiety that it's going to cause fear and depress the count. And so for our purposes here and for our campaign, as Melissa said, you know, we took a position against including it because we don't think measures like this are going to be helpful to us to get everyone counted. Just so you know, I mean, in Michigan alone, there are 600,000 immigrants. About half of them, give or take, are citizens. That's not to say that the other half are undocumented or are here illegally. They may be here legally on a work visa or on a student visa, or they might be a refugee or some other way that they're here legally. They just maybe happen not to be citizens. But if there is that fear in a community to a large extent, you know, that's going to be very, very detrimental to the state if our immigrant communities decide to sit this out. So whatever the decision is, we're going to be very honest. We're going to talk to people about the risks. We're going to talk to people about the benefits, and we're going to make sure that everybody has the most accurate and complete information to make a decision that's in the best interest of them and their families. But we're going to do everything we can to make sure that everyone is counted regardless of the Supreme Court decision.
Thanks, Joan. There actually is also a question about, you have the map for the campaign coverage, but obviously they can't tell based on their county who is covering that, or if there is a hub, or if there is a community action agency working on it from the nonprofit perspective. Do you want to mention the Be Counted website and how they can find out more about who is there, if there is a hub and that kind of stuff?
Yep, and if you go to BeCountedMI2020.com, and you click on the Engage tab, when you scroll down, you'll see the list of 13 census hubs and the counties that they're covering. Now, those are the 13 census hubs, as I mentioned, are large nonprofits like community foundations and United Ways, which you can see the list there and then the contact information. They're covering most all the counties, the 56 counties. The other counties of the state are being covered by action agencies. The Michigan Community Action Agency is a statewide organization that coordinates 28, I believe, 28 or 29 action agencies throughout the state that work on different activities and programs to help lift people out of poverty. They work with veterans, they work with people in poverty on all kinds of issues. And there are 6 of them that are covering the areas, the counties in orange. And, so you can reach out to either your action agency in your area or the census hub that is listed on the website to get involved in the nonprofit work that's being done. And also, as Melissa said, there are a number of city governments that are working on this and county governments that are working on this as well. So I'm aware and know of a lot of the local government complete count committees and organizations that are in this. So if you ask me, I can probably connect you with another organization that's working on this so that you can leverage your time and resources and not duplicate efforts.
Great, thanks, Joan. So we'll put your email in the box as well. Just really quickly, I think this will be the last question. Melissa, obviously volunteers are going to be so important for helping to raise awareness as well as encourage participation in the census. How are you advising, or what are you advising to nonprofits in terms of educating them, getting them up to speed? What are you just in general kind of advising organizations that are utilizing volunteers for this?
I think, like I said, they're making sure everyone knows the range of resources that are out there to help them with training for volunteers. One of the things that I've found in working with a number of organizations is that they've done this. They've done some census work in the past, so some of their volunteers are already ready to go in terms of the importance of it, and it's really just a matter of talking about some of the differences. But I think volunteers are really critical to the success of this. They're going to have networks that reach beyond just your typical network, and they're going to be able to help more broadly. I think while the census is a somewhat of a complex data collection enterprise, it's also pretty simple. And I think, if you schedule an hour or two conversation with most of your volunteers and really cover some key points and get them armed with good information, they can have a lot of impact, and they can really extend the impact of any one nonprofit into a larger area. So I think it's about resources. I think it's about being reasonable about how much you can actually get done, and then really trying to get engaged. And I think the other thing that I would add is to not feel like you are alone in starting any of this, but that really reach out to your fellow nonprofits in the area in which you're going to be working. See what they're doing and how they're working with volunteers, and see where there might be some overlap where you can all get together and maybe have some conversations that would be helpful.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. I think that concludes all of our questions. I'm going to hand it back to Nellie for conclusion.
Great. Thank you guys again so much for participating today. I've been trying to keep up with all the great resources that everyone mentioned during the call. So you should have found some of that in the chat box on the right, but a full list of those would also be sent out in the webinar follow-up before the end of the week. Yes, you will get a recording of today's webinar as well as a PDF of the slides that we went through for your reference there. I also tried to be fancy just now and include it as a handout. I'm pretty sure it worked, but in case it didn't, I think you can see the PDF of the slides now. So again, thank you so much for participating today. If you haven't heard it enough, the website that Joan and everyone's mentioned is listed here on the final slide for you. Again, we do have a weekly newsletter that we are sending out with all things census resources for you. So sign up for that if you haven't already. And our next webinar around the census will be held in September. So stay tuned and we will be sending out materials for that later this summer. Thank you again and hope you all have an excellent Monday. Bye.